The German Tiger tank remains one of the most iconic and feared weapons of World War II. With its thick armor, powerful 88-millimeter gun, and imposing presence on the battlefield, the Tiger became a legend during the war, and has maintained that legendary status in the decades since. But when the war ended in May 1945, roughly 1,300 Tiger I tanks and 492 Tiger II King Tiger tanks had been produced. The question that few people ask is this: what happened to all those Tigers after the war ended? Where did they go? Why are there so few examples surviving today? The answers reveal a fascinating story of destruction, salvage, testing, and preservation that spans continents and decades. To understand what happened to the Tigers after the war, we need to understand their condition when the war ended. Despite their fearsome reputation, Tigers were notoriously unreliable mechanically. They were over-engineered, requiring constant maintenance and consuming enormous amounts of fuel. During the final months of the war, as Germany's industrial capacity collapsed and fuel supplies dwindled, many Tigers were abandoned by their crews, not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they broke down and couldn't be repaired, or simply ran out of fuel with no possibility of refueling. When Allied forces advanced across Germany in the spring of 1945, they found Tigers everywhere. Some were burned-out hulks, destroyed in combat or by their own crews to prevent capture. Others sat abandoned beside roads, out of fuel, with mechanical problems, or simply left behind as German forces retreated. Still others were found in factories, partially assembled, never to be completed as the Third Reich collapsed around them. The sheer number of Tigers encountered by Allied forces was actually relatively small compared to other German tank types, reflecting the limited production numbers. But they were spread across the entire European theater. The immediate fate of most Tigers was inglorious. As Allied forces secured territory, military authorities faced an enormous problem of what to do with thousands of pieces of abandoned or captured German military equipment. Tigers, Panzers, half-tracks, artillery pieces, all the machinery of the Wehrmacht lay scattered across Europe. The priority was clearing this equipment to allow civilian life to resume, to clear roads for traffic, to remove dangerous munitions, and to salvage anything useful. Most Tigers met their end in scrapyards. Within months of the war's end, salvage operations were underway across Europe. Scrap metal was desperately needed for reconstruction. Europe's industrial infrastructure had been devastated by years of war, and steel was precious. Tigers, with their thick armor plate and heavy construction, represented tons of valuable scrap metal. Thousands of them, along with other German armored vehicles, were cut up for scrap. The armor was too thick and too hard to be easily recycled into new products. So much of it was melted down and refined. The steel reclaimed for reconstruction projects. The work of scrapping Tigers was difficult and dangerous. These were massive machines, weighing over 50 tons for the Tiger IV and nearly 70 tons for the Tiger II. They couldn't simply be loaded onto trucks and hauled away. Specialized equipment was needed. In many cases, the Tigers were cut apart where they sat, using torches to slice through the thick armor plate, reducing the tanks to manageable pieces that could be loaded and transported to steel mills. Men who had recently been soldiers found work in salvage crews, cutting apart the same tanks they had recently fought against or fought alongside. Some Tigers, however, escaped the cutting torch. The Allied powers, particularly Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union, were keenly interested in examining German military technology. During the war, whenever a tiger was captured intact or relatively intact, it was sent back to testing facilities for evaluation. After the war ended, this process continued but on a much larger scale. Intelligence teams combed through Germany, identifying tigers and other advanced German equipment that should be preserved for technical evaluation. The British were particularly interested in tigers. During the war, they had captured several and sent them to testing grounds in Britain for evaluation. After the war, they collected more. Some were shipped to Britain for display or testing. Others were evaluated in Germany itself at testing facilities established in the British occupation zone. The British were trying to understand what had made the tiger so formidable, examining its armor composition, its gun performance, its transmission and suspension systems. They were also comparing it to their own tank designs to see where improvements could be made. The Americans took a similar approach. U.S. Army intelligence teams identified tigers of interest and arranged for them to be shipped to the United States. Several tigers crossed the Atlantic after the war, destined for the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where the U.S. Army tested and evaluated military equipment. At Aberdeen, these tigers were put through exhaustive tests. They were driven to see how they performed. They were fired at to test their armor. Their guns were test-fired to evaluate accuracy and penetration. Every aspect of their design was studied and documented. One famous example is Tiger 131, a tiger I captured by British forces in Tunisia in 1943. This tank survived the war because it was already in British hands. Being used for evaluation and demonstration, after the war, it remained in British possession, eventually ending up at the Tank Museum in Bovington, England. Today, Tiger 131 is the only fully operational Tiger I tank in the world, carefully maintained and occasionally demonstrated for the public. Its survival is a remarkable exception to the fate of most tigers. The Soviets also collected tigers. As they advanced through Eastern Europe and into Germany, Red Army units encountered numerous tigers, both intact and destroyed. Stalin's regime was intensely interested in Western and German military technology, seeing it as a way to improve Soviet designs. Captured tigers were sent to testing facilities in the Soviet Union, where they were exhaustively studied. Soviet engineers examined every detail, measuring armor thickness, testing gun performance, evaluating mechanical reliability. Some of this information influenced post-war Soviet tank design. Though the Soviets generally favored their own design philosophy of simpler, more numerous tanks over the German approach of smaller numbers of more sophisticated vehicles. France also obtained Tigers after the war. As one of the victorious Allied powers, France received occupation zones in Germany and had access to captured German equipment. Several Tigers were taken to France for evaluation and display. Some ended up in French military museums. Others were used in French military films in the decades after the war, appearing in movies about World War II long after the last Tiger had seen actual combat. But even the Tigers preserved for testing and evaluation eventually faced an uncertain future. By the 1950s, tank technology had moved on. The Tigers, revolutionary in 1942, were obsolete by the early Cold War period. New tank designs incorporated lessons learned from the war, while adding new features like improved fire control systems, more reliable engines, and better armor layouts. The Tigers held by various militaries were no longer useful for testing. They were historical curiosities, nothing more. Many tigers that had survived the initial post-war scrapping now faced a second round of disposal. Military bases needed space. Maintaining non-operational historical vehicles was expensive and seemed pointless. Through the 1950s and 1960s, many of the tigers that had been preserved for evaluation were themselves scrapped. Others were abandoned at firing ranges, used as targets for testing new weapons. This was the fate of numerous tigers, reduced to bullet-riddled hulks on gunnery ranges, their thick armor finally defeated by post-war weapons they had never been designed to face. Some tigers met particularly ignominious ends. In the decades after the war, before historical preservation became a priority, old tanks were often used as range targets, as obstacles on military training grounds, or even as landfill. There are documented cases of tigers being buried in dumps or used to fill in bomb craters. The very characteristics that made them formidable in combat, their weight and size, made them useful for such purposes. But it also meant the complete destruction of historically significant artifacts. The Cold War brought another threat to surviving tigers. As tensions between East and West increased, military museums and collections on both sides of the Iron Curtain held tigers, but communication and cooperation were minimal. Tigers in Soviet hands effectively disappeared from Western knowledge. No one in the West knew their condition, their location, or even how many existed. It would not be until after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 that Western historians and collectors would discover what tigers had survived in Russian museums and storage facilities. By the 1970s, awareness was growing that tigers were becoming extremely rare. Military historians, tank enthusiasts, and museums began to realize that one of the most iconic tanks of World War II was on the verge of disappearing completely. Efforts began to locate and preserve surviving examples. This was difficult work. Tigers were scattered across the world, many in poor condition, some abandoned in remote locations, others held in military storage where access was difficult or impossible. One dramatic example of tiger recovery involves the Eastern Front. The flat, often marshy terrain of Eastern Europe, where much of the German-Soviet fighting occurred, proved to be a graveyard for tanks. Tigers that became bogged down in mud, disabled by combat damage, or abandoned due to mechanical failure, often sank into the soft ground. Over the decades, they became buried, lost beneath fields and forests. Beginning in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, recovery operations began to locate and excavate these buried tanks. The most famous recovery occurred in 2000 near St. Petersburg, Russia, where a Tiger the Y was excavated from a peat bog where it had lain since 1944. The tank had been remarkably preserved by the oxygen-free peat environment. Though heavily corroded and stripped of its turret, it represented a significant find. The tank was recovered, conserved, and eventually restored, providing an important example of a late-war tiger. Similar excavations have occurred across Eastern Europe, with tigers being pulled from rivers, lakes, and bogs where they had lain forgotten for decades. These recovery operations are complex and expensive. A tiger buried in a bog must be carefully excavated to avoid damaging it further. Specialized equipment is needed to lift and transport a 50 or 70-ton tank. Conservation work to stabilize the corroded metal and prevent further deterioration is painstaking and costly. But for historians and collectors, these efforts are worthwhile because tigers are so rare. Every recovered example provides new information about their construction and use. Today, the global inventory of surviving tigers is remarkably small given how many were produced. Of the roughly 1,300 tiger eye tanks built, fewer than 10 complete examples survive in museums worldwide. Of the 492 Tiger II King tigers produced, only 8 complete examples are known to exist. This represents a survival rate of less than 1%. By contrast, thousands of American Sherman tanks survive, both in museums and in private collections. The Soviet T-34, produced in even greater numbers, exists in hundreds of examples worldwide. The tiger's rarity is partly due to smaller production numbers, but also due to the systematic scrapping and destruction that occurred after the war. The surviving tigers are scattered across the world. Tiger 131 at Bovington is the only operational tiger reference. Other tiger eye examples exist at the Musée des Blindés in France, the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum, and the Militärhistorisches Museum in Germany. Each has its own story of survival. Some were captured during the war and preserved for testing. Others were abandoned and later recovered. Each represents a minor miracle of preservation against the general trend of destruction and disposal. The Tiger II King tigers that survive are equally rare and equally scattered. Examples exist at Bovington, at the Musée des Blindés, at Kubinka, at Fort Benning in the United States, and at several other museums. Like the tiger eye survivors, each has a unique history. Some were captured at the end of the war. Others were found abandoned in factories. The King tiger, at the German Tank Museum in Munster, was found in the British occupation zone after the war and preserved as a display piece, eventually being restored to museum condition. The rarity of tigers has had an interesting effect on their historical reputation. Because so few survive, because they're difficult to see in person, the tiger has taken on an almost mythical quality. Films, books, video games, and popular culture have amplified the tiger's reputation far beyond what historical accuracy would support. The tiger was formidable, certainly, but it was also unreliable, fuel-hungry, expensive to produce, and available in limited numbers. Its impact on the war's outcome was minimal compared to more numerous Allied tanks, but its rarity and iconic design have made it legendary. This legendary status has driven extraordinary efforts to preserve and restore the few surviving examples. The restoration of Tiger 131 to running condition was a years-long project requiring immense expertise and resources. Original parts are impossible to obtain, so everything must be fabricated from scratch, working from original plans and measurements taken from the tank itself. The expertise required spans multiple disciplines: mechanical engineering, metallurgy, historical research, and conservation science. The result is a tank that can be safely operated for demonstration purposes while being preserved for future generations. Similar restoration efforts have occurred with other tigers. Museums have invested heavily in conserving their tigers, recognizing that these vehicles are irreplaceable artifacts. Conservation work on tigers presents unique challenges. The steel used in German armor was often of variable quality, particularly late in the war, when Germany's resources were stretched thin. This steel corrodes in complex ways, requiring specialized treatment. The size and weight of tigers make conservation difficult. They can't simply be moved into climate-controlled storage. Instead, conservation must often occur in situ, with conservators working on tanks in open-air display areas. The private collector market has also played a role in tiger preservation, though this is controversial. In recent decades, wealthy private collectors have sought to acquire historic military vehicles, including tigers. When tigers or tiger parts come on the market, they command astronomical prices. A complete tiger, if one were ever offered for sale, would likely sell for millions of dollars. Even parts and components are extremely valuable. This has created a market for recovery operations, with teams searching Eastern European battlefields and recovery sites for buried tigers that might be restored and sold. Some view private ownership of tigers positively, arguing that private collectors have the resources to properly restore and maintain these vehicles, and that private ownership ensures their preservation. Others argue that tigers are historically significant artifacts that belong in public museums, where they can be studied and viewed by everyone, not locked away in private collections. This debate has no easy resolution, but it reflects the growing recognition that tigers are cultural heritage items, not just old military equipment. The fate of tigers after World War II also reflects broader patterns in how societies deal with the material legacy of war. In the immediate post-war period, when memories were fresh and reconstruction was the priority, German military equipment was viewed primarily as scrap metal or as intelligence assets. There was little sentiment about preserving it for historical purposes. The focus was on moving forward, rebuilding, and putting the war behind. Scrapping Tigers and other German tanks was part of this process, removing physical reminders of the Nazi regime and the war it had caused. As decades passed and the war receded into history, attitudes changed. By the 1970s and 1980s, the war was history rather than living memory for many people. Museums and historians began to argue for preserving artifacts from the war, including German equipment, not to glorify it, but to ensure that future generations could understand what happened. This shift in attitude came too late to save most tigers, but it did lead to efforts to preserve and restore the few that remained. The story of what happened to German tiger tanks after World War II is ultimately a story of loss. Of the nearly 1,800 tigers produced during the war, fewer than 20 complete examples survive today. The vast majority were destroyed in combat, abandoned and scrapped, or disposed of in the decades after the war. Each surviving tiger represents a narrow escape from destruction, preserved by chance, by military interest, or by the dedication of historians and collectors who recognized their historical value. These surviving tigers serve multiple purposes today. They are historical artifacts, providing tangible connections to World War II. They are teaching tools, helping students and the public understand the technology and tactics of armored warfare. They are memorials, reminding us of the costs of war and the engineering achievements, however misguided in their ultimate purpose, of the men who designed and built them. And they are rare treasures, mechanical dinosaurs, from a conflict that shaped the modern world. The tigers that survive today are carefully maintained and preserved. Museum conservators monitor their condition, treating corrosion, stabilizing components, and documenting every detail of their construction. When Tiger 131 is driven at Bovington's annual Tank Fest demonstration, it's done with extraordinary care, with mechanics and engineers ensuring that this irreplaceable artifact isn't damaged. Each running demonstration is a calculated risk, balancing the educational value of seeing a tiger in motion against the possibility of mechanical failure or damage. For most people, the closest they'll ever come to a tiger is through photographs, films, or video games. The surviving examples are scattered across different continents, held in museums that not everyone can visit. This has made tigers into objects of fascination and speculation. Countless books have been written about them. Documentaries examine their technical specifications and combat history. Video games allow players to command virtual tigers in simulated battles. Model kit manufacturers produce tiger kits in numerous scales, with enthusiasts building detailed replicas. All of this keeps the tiger in public consciousness decades after the last one saw combat. The excavation and recovery of buried tigers continues today. Eastern Europe, particularly the former Soviet Union, remains a source of archaeological discoveries. Every few years, another tiger is found buried in a bog, submerged in a river, or hidden in a forest. Each discovery generates excitement in the historical and collector communities. Will it be complete? Is it restorable? What can it tell us about tiger construction and use? These questions drive continued exploration and recovery efforts. However, these recovery operations also raise ethical questions. When a tiger is discovered, who owns it? The landowner, where it's found? The government of the country where it's located? The descendants of German soldiers who crewed it? Museums argue they should have first claim because they can properly preserve and display such artifacts. Collectors argue they have the resources to fund restoration. Governments sometimes claim ownership based on laws governing archaeological finds or military artifacts. These disputes can be complex and contentious, sometimes taking years to resolve. The German government has taken particular interest in tigers recovered in recent decades. Germany's relationship with its World War II heritage is complicated, balancing the need to remember and learn from history against concerns about glorifying the Nazi regime. Tigers and other German military equipment from the Nazi period occupy an uncomfortable space in German memory. They're historically significant, but they're also reminders of a regime that committed unprecedented crimes. German museums that display tigers go to great lengths to contextualize them, explaining not just their technical specifications, but also the regime that produced them and the war crimes committed by the military that used them. The tiger's mechanical unreliability, which plagued it during the war, continues to affect surviving examples today. Tiger 131's operational status is maintained only through constant care and occasional replacement of worn components. The tank's original transmission design was problematic when it was new and hasn't improved with age. Each time Tiger 131 runs, there's a risk of mechanical failure that could damage irreplaceable components. This is why operational demonstrations are limited and carefully controlled. Museums with non-operational tigers face different challenges, preventing deterioration while keeping the tanks accessible for study and display. Some tigers survive only as partial examples. Museums hold turrets without hulls, hulls without turrets, or major components separated from complete vehicles. These partial tigers are still valuable for research and display, showing particular aspects of tiger design and construction. The German Tank Museum in Munster displays tiger components alongside complete vehicles, helping visitors understand how these complex machines were constructed and how they functioned. Cutaway displays show the tiger's internal arrangement, the placement of its engine, transmission, ammunition storage, and crew positions. The ammunition used by tigers has its own post-war story. The 88mm gun that armed both the Tiger I and Tiger II fired specialized armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Millions of these rounds were produced during the war. After the war ended, vast stocks of German ammunition were captured by Allied forces. Most was destroyed as too dangerous to keep, but examples were preserved for testing and evaluation. Today, original Tiger ammunition is extremely rare, with examples held in military museums and research collections. This rarity means that when Tiger 131 is demonstrated, it never fires live ammunition. The risk to the irreplaceable gun barrel and the lack of period-correct ammunition make live firing impossible. The legacy of what happened to Tigers after World War II offers lessons about preservation and historical memory. The casual disposal of thousands of Tigers in the decades after the war reflects a society eager to move on from a traumatic period. Only later, when Tigers had become rare, did preservation become a priority. This pattern has repeated with other artifacts from the war. If similar conflicts occur in the future, will we be more careful about preserving material culture from the start? Or will the immediate needs of reconstruction and disposal take precedence over long-term historical preservation? For tank enthusiasts and military historians, the scarcity of surviving Tigers is a constant source of frustration. So much was lost that could have been preserved. If even 10% of Tigers produced had been saved, we would have over 100 complete examples today, enough to thoroughly understand variations in production, to compare early and late models, to maintain multiple operational examples. Instead, we have fewer than 20, each one precious and irreplaceable. This scarcity has made every Tiger recovery operation significant, every conservation project important, every research opportunity valuable. The story of Tigers after World War II is not quite finished. More Tigers may yet be recovered from Eastern European battlefields. Current examples may be further restored. New conservation techniques may allow better preservation of existing survivors. And our understanding of Tigers continues to evolve as researchers discover new documents, interview surviving veterans, and analyze surviving vehicles in greater detail. Each surviving Tiger has secrets still to reveal about its construction, its modifications, its combat history. In the end, the German Tiger tanks that survived World War II are survivors in the truest sense. They survived combat, survived the chaos of Germany's defeat, survived the post-war scrapping operations, survived decades of neglect or hard use, and survived into an era when their historical value is finally recognized and appreciated. They stand today as monuments to engineering ambition, to the brutality of armored warfare, and to the importance of preserving physical connections to history. The Tigers are gone, almost all of them, reduced to scrap or rust decades ago. But the few that remain tell the story of all the others, bearing witness to a conflict that changed the world and to the machines that fought in it.